What if the Hundred Years' War ended with English rule over France? Dark clouds gather over the smoking ruins of a medieval battlefield. A crow circles above shattered armor, broken lances, and the bodies of men who fell for crowns and kingdoms. In the distance, the fluttering banners of lions and lilies clash, whipped by a cold wind. It is the year 1453, and Europe stands at a crossroads. History tells us that the French would emerge victorious, uniting their kingdom and pushing back the English. But what if, against all odds, the story had ended differently? What if the Hundred Years' War had ended not with France's triumph, but with English rule stretching from the white cliffs of Dover to the gates of the Pyrenees? The Hundred Years' War did not begin with a trumpet blast or a sudden act of betrayal, but with a slow tightening of dynastic knots that would strangle Europe for more than a century. At its heart lay a question of bloodlines and legitimacy, a question that would decide not merely who wore the crown of France, but who would dominate the future of Western Christendom. In the year 1328, the Capetian dynasty of France, which had ruled for centuries, came to an abrupt end with the death of Charles IV. The throne, glittering yet perilously vacant, became the subject of fierce contention. By blood, one of the strongest claims belonged to Edward III of England, grandson of the French king Philip IV through his mother, Isabella of France. To Edward and his supporters, the line was clear. His blood was Capetian, his right undeniable. But the French nobility saw the specter of foreign domination. They invoked the ancient Salic law, which excluded succession through the female line, and placed the crown instead upon the head of Philip VI, a cousin from the Valois branch. Thus was born the seed of discord, a bitter feud dressed in the solemn robes of legality. To Edward, the rejection of his claim was not only an insult, but a theft, a denial of his rightful inheritance. To the French, his ambition was a looming threat, a dagger pointed at the heart of their sovereignty. What began as a question of law quickly became a contest of pride, power, and survival. Beneath the royal quarrel, deeper currents stirred. England had long relied on the wool trade, and France's regions, particularly Flanders, were essential markets. Tensions over tariffs and alliances simmered beneath the surface, adding fuel to dynastic rage. The nobles of both kingdoms carried grievances like tinder, waiting for the spark that would set all Europe aflame. That spark came in 1337, when Edward formally declared himself King of France in defiance of Philip VI. With that act, the air was split, and the dogs of war were unleashed. The seas churned with raiding fleets, the fields of Normandy and Aquitaine were scorched, and for the first time in centuries, the idea of France itself trembled on the edge of extinction. The opening campaigns revealed the raw ferocity of the struggle. England, smaller and less wealthy, wielded a weapon that would shatter chivalric norms: the longbow. At the Battle of Crécy in 1346, waves of French knights, glittering in armor, were cut down by storms of arrows that fell like iron rain. The flower of French nobility perished in the mud, their banners trampled, their prestige in tatters. A decade later, at Poitiers, the Black Prince, Edward's eldest son, captured King John II of France himself, parading him like a trophy through English camps. For a time, it seemed the very soil of France might kneel before the lions of England. But war is never simple, never linear. France, though bloodied, was vast and rich. Its countryside could absorb defeat and still raise new armies, still feed resistance. The English, for all their triumphs, lacked the resources to finish what they had begun. Instead, the war dragged on. Not a single clash, but a century of campaigns, truces, betrayals, and renewed bloodshed. Behind the glitter of battles lay the suffering of ordinary people. Villages were burned to ash, fields left barren, families uprooted again and again as armies marched through. And as if war was not curse enough, plague struck in the mid-14th century, carrying away millions in both kingdoms, leaving empty fields, silent streets, and a Europe hollowed out by death. This was no mere quarrel of kings. It was an age-defining struggle. The crowns of England and France became symbols of something greater, of two competing destinies for Europe. The war fused dynastic ambition with questions of national identity, chivalric pride, with the brutal reality of medieval conflict. For generations, children grew to manhood, knowing nothing but war. Mothers wept over sons taken to battle, and the land itself seemed to groan under the endless weight of armies. And yet, even in those early decades, when English victories piled high and the French crown lay captive, the future was far from secure. The tide of fortune ebbed and flowed, and no one could yet foresee which kingdom would emerge from the storm and which would be broken by it. The 100 Years' War stretched on like an endless storm, devouring decades, reshaping nations, and leaving entire generations scarred. What began as a dynastic quarrel grew into a crucible of endurance, testing not only kings and knights, but the very foundations of two kingdoms. England and France had set themselves upon a path of mutual destruction, and neither could step away. England, though smaller in land and population, struck with a sharp and deadly blade. Its armies, drilled and disciplined, wielded the longbow with ruthless precision. Again and again, French charges broke like waves against iron rain. In 1415, on a sodden field at Agincourt, Henry V led a weary, outnumbered English force to one of the most stunning victories of the Middle Ages. The French knights, symbols of centuries of chivalric pride, drowned in mud and blood. The corpses of nobles littered the field, their banners trampled into the earth. Henry's triumph thundered across Europe, the roar of a lion that seemed destined to devour the lilies of France. The shock of Agincourt paved the way for a moment of near-total English ascendancy. 5 years later, the Treaty of Troyes shook the foundations of the French crown. Signed in 1420, it recognized Henry V not merely as a conqueror, but as heir to the throne of France. His marriage to Catherine of Valois bound the two dynasties, promising that their son would rule over a realm stretching from the chalk cliffs of Dover to the vineyards of Bordeaux. For England, it was the ultimate vindication: legitimacy conferred by treaty, conquest crowned by law. And yet, destiny faltered. In 1422, at the height of his glory, Henry V died suddenly, not on the battlefield, but from illness. His son, Henry VI, inherited both crowns while still an infant. A baby could not inspire loyalty, nor command armies, nor hold together a fragile pact forged in blood. At the very moment when the English lion seemed poised to roar its loudest, it stumbled, its claws blunted by fate. France, beaten and humiliated, appeared broken. Vast swaths of the north lay under English occupation. Paris itself bowed to English authority, while the rightful heir, the Dauphin Charles, languished in exile, mocked as the King of Bourges, a ruler without a crown, a monarch without a realm. Many believed France stood on the brink of extinction. And then came a miracle, or at least what seemed like one. In 1429, a teenage peasant girl from Domremy stepped onto the stage of history. Joan of Arc, claiming visions of saints, declared that she had been chosen by God to save France. With nothing but faith and fire, she rallied a nation that had nearly surrendered to despair. Under her banner, the French lifted the siege of Orléans, a victory that reverberated across Europe. From that moment, the tide shifted. Soldiers fought with renewed conviction, and the people believed once more that France was not yet lost. Her capture and execution in 1431 might have silenced her voice, but instead it amplified it. Burned at the stake, she became a martyr, her ashes carried on the wind, her legend etched into the hearts of her people. France now had more than armies. It had a symbol, a saintly vision that transcended politics and law. Meanwhile, England struggled to sustain its far-flung empire. The cost of endless campaigning drained its treasury. Heavy taxation bred resentment, while factions within the court sharpened their knives against one another. What had once been a source of pride now became a burden too heavy to bear. The lion had overreached, and its grip on France began to slip. In the decades that followed, Charles VII reclaimed his kingdom piece by piece. Normandy was retaken, Gascony followed, and finally, in 1453, The Battle of Castillon delivered the decisive blow. French cannon thundered, shattering English defenses, marking not just the end of a battle, but the end of an era. With the fall of Bordeaux, England's last great hold in France was torn away. Only the port of Calais remained, a lonely fragment of a dream turned to dust. Thus the Hundred Years' War concluded, not with a single clash of kings, but with exhaustion, attrition, and the slow turning of fortune's wheel. Both kingdoms were left scarred. France, battered yet unbroken, emerged more unified and more determined than ever before. England, stripped of its continental ambitions, turned inward, its nobles restless, its monarchy vulnerable to the storm that would soon erupt into civil war. The long war had drained Europe of blood and treasure, leaving fields empty, cities scarred, and memories heavy with grief. But though the fighting ended, its echoes lingered in every ruined village, every silent churchyard, every scarred generation that had known nothing but war. As the long war dragged itself toward its final decades, the fate of nations seemed to hang by a single thread. England had tasted the sweetness of near-total victory. France had stared into the abyss of collapse, and yet both kingdoms were still locked in the deadly embrace of war. It was in this twilight that individual figures, kings, generals, visionaries, emerged to steer the course of history. Among them, none cast a longer shadow than the warrior king Henry V, and the peasant girl who rose to sainthood, Joan of Arc. Henry V had been more than a conqueror. He was a commander of rare genius, disciplined, relentless, and utterly certain of his destiny. His victory at Agincourt was not mere luck. It was the culmination of careful strategy, of a mind that could turn weakness into strength. He understood the longbow not just as a weapon, but as a force capable of reshaping the battlefield itself. With Henry alive, there seemed no limit to England's ambitions. It was he who secured the Treaty of Troyes, he who bent France to the brink, and he who envisioned a single crown uniting both realms. His sudden death, cutting short a reign that promised so much, remains one of the most fateful moments in medieval history. On the opposite side of the saga stood Joan of Arc. Her arrival defied every expectation. She was no noble, no trained warrior, no seasoned tactician, and yet, clad in armor, carrying her white banner emblazoned with sacred symbols, she became the rallying cry of a desperate nation. At Orléans, she rode into the thick of battle, lifting spirits as much as lifting swords. To hardened soldiers, she was a sign of divine favor. To the weary, starving peasants, she was proof that God had not abandoned them. Her triumphs transformed the French cause from a flickering ember into a roaring fire. These two figures, Henry, the king who might have ruled both kingdoms, and Joan, the maiden who revived a dying France, represent the very heart of the Hundred Years' War's uncertainty. Theirs were the hands that held the balance of destiny, hands that shaped battles, treaties, and the will of nations. But history is made not only by individuals, but by the fragile coalitions around them. The English crown leaned heavily upon the alliance of Burgundy, whose dukes were among the most powerful princes in Europe. So long as Burgundy stood with England, Paris remained under their control, and the dream of union endured. Yet Burgundian loyalty was fickle, driven by ambition and calculation rather than devotion. Their eventual shift of allegiance to the French crown shattered England's hopes and opened the door to France's resurgence. By the 1430s, the war reached a knife's edge. In the north, English garrisons still held firm. In the south, Charles VII, mocked and dismissed, slowly gathered strength. France remained divided, its nobility fractured, its cities torn between rival banners. It was a kingdom in civil war as much as in foreign war. Victory was not yet certain for either side. One can imagine the tension in the courts of Europe. In London, the regents of young Henry VI clung to the promises of Troyes, insisting that the crowns were forever bound. In Bourges, Charles and his loyalists whispered prayers for survival, knowing that one more crushing defeat might extinguish their line forever. In the castles of Burgundy, dukes calculated where fortune lay, measuring loyalty in gold and power rather than honor. For every triumph, there was a counterstroke. For every step forward, a stumble back. It was an age of uncertainty, where the outcome could tilt in an instant, and so the war lurched onward, sometimes favoring the lilies, sometimes the lions, always exacting its brutal toll. As the 15th century moved toward its midpoint, the final chapters of the war approached. Joan's martyrdom had sealed her place in legend, but her death did not break the spirit she had ignited. Charles VII pressed forward, reforming his armies, reclaiming territory, and preparing to drive the English from his soil once and for all. England, meanwhile, faced growing unrest, divisions in its court, and a monarch too weak to hold two kingdoms together. Yet pause here, at this precipice. For all the suffering, all the victories and defeats, the end was not yet written. Castillon had not yet been fought, Bordeaux had not yet fallen, Calais had not yet become England's last continental outpost. The stage was set, the players in position, the outcome balanced on the edge of a blade. And so we must ask, what if, in this fragile moment, the scales had tipped the other way? Now let us leave behind the history we know and step into the one that might have been. Imagine France in the 1430s, weary, divided, her crown contested, her people crushed by famine and plague. Paris remains in English hands, Burgundy holds the balance of power, and the Dauphin Charles is still mocked as the King of Bourges, a pretender surrounded by shrinking loyalists. The tide that in our history turned toward French salvation now turns instead against it. At Orléans, where in truth Joan of Arc lit the torch of resistance, events take a darker turn. Perhaps an arrow finds her early, before her banner can rise above the walls. Perhaps the relief army falters, its morale broken without the fire of her presence. The English, reinforced and determined, storm the city, crushing the last real bastion of French defiance. Joan's name never becomes legend. Her voice is silenced before it ever shakes the heavens, and with her fall, the fragile spirit of France collapses. The Burgundians, watching carefully, see no future in a disinherited Dauphin. They double their loyalty to the English crown, binding their fortunes to the regency of young Henry VI. Paris celebrates the coronation of the boy king, not only as King of England, but as the rightful King of France, an anointing that carries the sanction of treaty and the authority of the Church. The union of crowns, fragile in our history, here becomes iron. One by one, French nobles bend the knee. Some do so reluctantly, others eagerly, sensing rewards in siding with the victor. Those who resist are crushed in sieges that devastate the countryside. Castles are razed, and villages that once cried "Vive le roi Charles" now echo with silence or burn in smoke. The Dauphin himself flees farther south, his court withering, his authority eroding until he is little more than a fugitive prince. Within a few years, his claim is extinguished. By 1435, in this alternate world, the 100 Years' War does not drag onward, but concludes in triumph for England. With Burgundy as its staunch ally and Paris as its jewel, the Anglo-French union is sealed. Treaties are signed not in humiliation for England, but in humiliation for France. The fleur-de-lis, once defiant, is now stitched alongside the Lions of England on banners that flutter across castles and cathedrals. The map of Europe is transformed, from the white cliffs of Dover to the Rhone Valley, from Bordeaux's rolling vineyards to Normandy's storm-beaten coasts, one crown rules them all. It is a realm richer, larger, and more powerful than any in Western Europe. No longer are England and France bitter enemies across the Channel. They are a single, sprawling kingdom. The dream of Plantagenets made real. The immediate impact is seismic. The papacy in Rome blesses the union, recognizing Henry VI as the rightful sovereign of two crowns. The courts of Castile and Aragon, suddenly staring at a colossus to the north, scramble to secure their alliances. The Holy Roman Emperor, watching uneasily, fears encirclement. Even the Italian city-states, wealthy and cunning, whisper of this new behemoth that may soon extend its hand toward their markets. But unity is never simple. The English ruling class must learn to govern not just their island, but the vast and turbulent lands of France. Taxes must be balanced between two peoples, languages must coexist, laws must be woven into a single tapestry. Yet in this alternate timeline, necessity becomes the mother of invention. With Burgundy shoring up the north, and the English monarchy directing its power from Paris and London alike, a new kind of empire begins to take shape. The 100 Years' War in our world ended with exhaustion and the rise of two distinct nations. Here, it ends with the birth of one. An Anglo-French kingdom, immense and fragile, looms over Europe like a storm cloud, promising both prosperity and peril. The question is no longer whether England can rule France, but whether it can hold it. And as the ink dries on treaties and the banners of victory fly, new conflicts, new rivalries, and new dangers begin to stir. The ink on the treaties was barely dry before blood once again soaked the soil. Victory on parchment did not erase hatred in the hearts of men, nor did it ease the crushing weight of conquest. France was now under English rule, but not all of France accepted it. In the Loire Valley, stubborn loyalists refused to bow. In Languedoc and the south, whispers of defiance spread from tavern to chapel. Though the Dauphin had vanished into obscurity, his cause lingered like smoke after fire, smoldering, unseen, yet capable of reigniting at any moment. The English crown, flush with triumph, sought to enforce its authority with both steel and coin. Garrisons dotted the countryside, fortresses flew the banners of lions and lilies united, and sheriffs collected taxes to fund the weight of empire. In Paris, English officials paraded through streets lined with uneasy silence. To some, they brought order, restoring markets and clearing bandits from the roads. To others, they were occupiers, their accents a constant reminder that France was ruled by foreigners. The South became the crucible of resistance. In Toulouse and across Gascony, bands of loyalists took to the hills, striking from forests and mountain passes, ambushing supply trains and slaughtering isolated patrols. The English called them brigands. The people called them patriots. Retaliation was swift and merciless. Villages suspected of harboring rebels were put to the torch, their ashes scattered on the wind. Families were dragged from their homes, accused of treason, and punished as examples. The message was clear: resistance would be crushed without mercy, yet brutality bred only more defiance. Peasant uprisings erupted in pockets across the countryside. Farmers armed with pitchforks and hunting bows attacked convoys, driven less by loyalty to a crown than by desperation under the weight of taxes. French nobles, outwardly sworn to Henry VI, secretly funded rebels, hedging their bets in case fortune shifted again. Even among the Burgundians, cracks appeared as younger lords resented English dominance. The unity that had brought victory was already fraying at the edges. Across the Channel, England itself strained beneath the burden. The war had bled its treasury dry, and now the cost of administering a vast continental empire only grew heavier. Parliament grumbled as coin flowed to garrisons in Normandy instead of roads in Kent. Merchants complained of new levies, peasants muttered about the weight of endless demands, and rival factions at court sharpened their daggers for political advantage. The glory of ruling France was undeniable, but so too was the price. Still, the crown projected confidence. Henry VI's regents organized lavish ceremonies, blending English and French symbols into a single spectacle of unity. In Notre Dame, choirs sang hymns that praised the young king as the chosen ruler of two nations. Chroniclers wrote of a destiny fulfilled, of God's will made manifest in the triumph of lions and lilies together. For a moment, it seemed as though the dream might truly endure. But beneath the grandeur, danger simmered. The French countryside remained restless, its people unwilling to forget humiliation. English soldiers patrolling foreign streets were targets of hatred, never at ease, always glancing over their shoulders. And in the courts of Europe, rivals circled like wolves. Aragon and Castile eyed the fractured south, weighing opportunities. The Holy Roman Emperor wondered how long Burgundy would remain content as a junior partner. Scotland, though weakened, still nursed ancient enmity and plotted revenge. By the 1440s, the Anglo-French kingdom was at once mighty and precarious. Its armies could march from Calais to Bordeaux. Its banners flew across the heartland of Europe, yet its foundations were fragile, built on forced loyalty and suppressed dissent. The fires of rebellion had not been extinguished. They merely flickered, waiting for a gust of wind to roar back to life. And in the shadows of castles and cathedrals, conspiracies were already forming. French lords whispered of assassinations, secret alliances, and hidden heirs. English nobles, weary of continental entanglements, began to wonder if the empire was a prize or a trap. The victory that had seemed absolute was about to ignite new battles, not of open war alone, but of intrigue, betrayal, and civil strife. The 100 Years' War had ended in triumph for England, yet the struggle for its spoils was only just beginning. The union of the English and French crowns did not remain a matter between two kingdoms alone. Like the tolling of a great bell, its reverberations spread across all of Europe, unsettling thrones, stirring rivalries, and reshaping the delicate balance of power. In the courts of kings and emperors, whispers turned to alarm. What had once been a rivalry across a narrow sea had become a colossus stretching from the Atlantic to the Channel, from the northern coast to the wine valleys of Aquitaine. In Iberia, the crowns of Castile and Aragon looked north with unease. They had been engaged in their own reconquista, pressing ever deeper into Moorish lands, dreaming of uniting Spain under one banner. Yet with an Anglo-French empire at their doorstep, their ambitions seemed suddenly vulnerable. If the lions and lilies marched south, the Pyrenees might not stand long as a barrier. Thus, the Spanish kingdoms hastened to strengthen ties with Portugal, building alliances that could counterbalance the behemoth in the north. To the east, the Holy Roman Empire, already a patchwork of princes, electors, and bishops, faced a different fear. Its emperor, nominally the guardian of Christendom, now saw a neighbor stronger and more centralized than his own divided realm. Burgundy, long a powerful duchy straddling imperial and French lands, found itself elevated yet constrained. Its loyalty bought with English rewards, but its independence subtly eroded. The emperor worried that, in time, Burgundy might become a puppet, wielding imperial lands on behalf of the Anglo-French crown. The seeds of tension between London, Paris, and the imperial court were planted. Italy, too, felt the tremors. The wealthy city-states, Florence, Venice, Milan, thrived on trade, banking, and mercenary armies. For them, the union across the Channel was less a military threat than an economic one. With Bordeaux's wine flowing freely into English ports, with wool from the Midlands feeding looms in Flanders, the Anglo-French kingdom threatened to dominate continental trade. Merchants in Florence muttered of rising competition. Venetian envoys speculated whether this new empire would turn its gaze toward the Mediterranean, seeking a share of the spice routes. But the most immediate victim of this new order was Scotland. For centuries, the Auld Alliance had bound Scotland to France, a counterweight to English aggression. Now that France itself bent the knee to England, Scotland found itself alone. The Northern Kingdom, smaller and poorer, could no longer count on French arms to strike at England's flank. Its borders became perilous, its independence fragile. Scottish nobles quarreled bitterly, some urging desperate alliances with the Norse or even the distant kingdoms of Poland, while others counseled submission. The dream of a free Scotland dimmed beneath the looming shadow of Anglo-French might. Yet it was not only politics that shifted. Economically, the Union redrew the map of commerce. English wool, once traded under complex tariffs, now flowed directly into French workshops. The cloth markets of Flanders boomed, binding merchant fortunes to the stability of the dual crown. Bordeaux, already famous for its wines, became a jewel of trans-channel trade. Its barrels shipped not just to London, but to Bruges, Lubeck, and beyond. The Seine and the Thames pulsed with commerce, their ports crowded with vessels laden with goods from two nations now fused into one. At first, prosperity seemed possible. Farmers saw new markets open, merchants dreamed of greater profits, and kings boasted of riches that rivaled even the treasures of Italy. Yet the very scale of the empire created tension. French peasants resented English taxes, English merchants bristled at competition from Parisian guilds, and noble families on both sides of the Channel eyed each other with suspicion. To rule was one thing, to unite was another. And still, across Europe, the question lingered: how long could such a vast and unnatural union last? Rival courts began to conspire in secret. Agents of Aragon whispered in Gascony, hoping to spark rebellion. Imperial envoys sowed discord among Burgundian lords. Even the Pope, wary of any single crown growing too mighty, maneuvered carefully, blessing the young Henry VI, but quietly encouraging resistance to unchecked dominance. The Anglo-French Empire loomed like a storm cloud, its power undeniable, its future uncertain. And as the rest of Europe braced for its next move, one truth was clear. The end of the 100 Years' War was not the end of conflict. It was the opening act of a new and far more dangerous drama. For all its might, the Anglo-French crown was a fragile colossus. The banners of lions and lilies fluttered over castles and cathedrals, but beneath their proud colors, resentment grew like rot within timber. The victory that had united two kingdoms also united their burdens. Taxes were heavier, armies more demanding, loyalties more divided. By the middle of the 15th century, the cracks in this vast empire began to widen, and through them poured rebellion, rivalry, and betrayal. At the center of the storm stood Henry VI. In him, two crowns rested uneasily, yet he was a monarch unfit for the weight of one. Timid, pious, and prone to bouts of instability, Henry inspired neither fear nor loyalty. His father had been a warrior king, but he was a king of whispers and hesitation. In London, nobles muttered that the French crown had drained England of blood and gold. In Paris, courtiers sneered that their ruler was little more than a boy carried to coronation on the shoulders of others. The Wars of the Roses, in our own history, erupted within England alone. But in this alternate world, their fires spread across both sides of the Channel. Lancaster and York did not simply battle for control of Westminster, they battled for dominion over Paris, Rouen, and Bordeaux as well. Every city, every fortress, every noble family was forced to take sides. The streets of London filled with the red rose of Lancaster, while banners of York were raised not only in the shires of England, but above the ramparts of French strongholds. In Normandy, dukes who once bent the knee to England saw opportunity in chaos. Some declared for York, others for Lancaster, and still others declared for themselves, hoping to carve out independence. Gascony, far in the south, clung stubbornly to English authority, its loyalty bought with trade privileges and ancient ties. Yet in Brittany, alliances shifted with each passing season, lords swearing fealty to whichever faction promised the most protection. Paris became a cauldron of intrigue. English officials patrolled the streets, but daggers flashed in alleys, conspirators whispered in cloisters, and rumors spread faster than sermons. Rebellion no longer came only from the countryside. It erupted in the heart of the empire. Guilds and merchants, weary of instability, threw their weight behind rival factions, financing uprisings that stained the cobblestones with blood. The Burgundians, ever calculating, seized their chance. Once allies, now they maneuvered to position themselves as kingmakers. They offered troops to Yorkists, then to Lancastrians, demanding lands, titles, and independence in return. Their ambitions grew bold, perhaps not merely to influence the Anglo-French Empire, but to inherit it. In their grand halls, dukes dreamed not of loyalty, but of thrones. The common people suffered most. English soldiers, weary of endless campaigning, looted villages to fill empty purses. French peasants, caught between rival banners, were forced to feed whichever army passed their fields. Rebellion spread not as a single flame, but as countless sparks, small fires igniting across the land until the whole kingdom seemed to smolder. And yet, amid chaos, something unexpected took shape. Children born to English fathers and French mothers no longer saw themselves as wholly one or the other. In marketplaces and ports, Tongues mingled, accents blended, customs fused. A new identity, fragile and uncertain, began to emerge. Not English, not French, but Anglo-French. It was an identity forged in fire, an unintended consequence of conquest and war. But identity alone could not hold the empire together. The throne itself trembled as factions sharpened swords and daggers alike. Across the Channel, rival armies prepared to march, each proclaiming that their rose, red or white, would restore order. Across France, nobles chose sides, while some whispered of resurrecting the Valois line, of restoring a purely French crown. The dream of Henry V, once realized in blood and treaty, now risked shattering into 1,000 pieces. What had been won at Orléans, Paris, and beyond was slipping through fingers like sand. The Anglo-French Empire was not merely at risk of rebellion, it stood on the brink of tearing itself apart from within. And as civil war brewed in palaces and villages alike, one question loomed over Europe. Would the Anglo-French crown endure the storms of faction, or would it collapse into ruins more violent than the war that created it? The storm of rebellion tore across the Anglo-French realm with the fury of a tempest. What had once been hailed as the triumph of unity now cracked under the strain of division. The Wars of the Roses, spilling across both England and France, became more than a dynastic feud. They were the crucible in which a new order was forged. The cities suffered first. Paris, jewel of the dual crown, became a battlefield of intrigue and blood. Yorkist banners fluttered from its towers one year, only to be torn down and replaced with Lancastrian roses the next. Merchants shuttered their shops, fearful of riots. Guilds split along factional lines, sending coin to fund rival armies. The once proud capital of Christendom's largest kingdom now reeked of smoke, betrayal, and despair. In the countryside, war was a ceaseless plague. Normandy's castles changed hands with dizzying speed, each conquest leaving behind ruins and ashes. In the south, Gascony's loyalty to England drew it into endless clashes with neighbors who longed for autonomy. The peasants, battered by taxation and pillage alike, sometimes rose in revolt, but more often they simply fled, abandoning farms, seeking refuge in forests, living like shadows in the land that was once their home. Yet, amid ruin, the machinery of empire did not collapse entirely. English and French administrators, weary of chaos, began to cooperate in unexpected ways. Some towns demanded that, regardless of who held the crown, laws and markets must function. Clerks and scribes continued to collect taxes, even as they quietly shifted allegiance between York and Lancaster depending on whose troops were nearest. For the first time, governance became less about the person of the king and more about the survival of the realm itself. It was in this crucible that the idea of an Anglo-French identity strengthened. Nobles intermarried across the Channel, less out of romance than survival. Children grew up speaking two tongues, praying in Latin, and swearing loyalty to whichever banner offered security. In marketplaces from Rouen to London, accents mingled, and a hybrid culture emerged. Chivalry tempered by pragmatism, law shaped by both common law and Roman tradition, faith colored by the memory of saints, both French and English. But unity born from necessity came at a price. The monarchy itself was hollowed out, its authority broken by factional wars. Instead, power flowed into the hands of nobles, councils, and cities. The Burgundians played their hand masterfully, gaining near independence, while still draping themselves in the cloak of loyalty. Brittany followed suit, leveraging the chaos to extract privileges. Even Gascony, once fiercely loyal, began to demand autonomy in exchange for continued support. By the late 15th century, the Anglo-French kingdom was no longer the vision Henry V had dreamed of. It was not a centralized empire ruled by one strong king, but a loose federation bound by fragile threads of language, trade, and necessity. In London, Parliament grew more powerful, emboldened by the chaos to claim greater say over taxation and policy. In Paris, Estates General re-emerged, filled with nobles and clergy who demanded influence in exchange for their obedience. the continent watched with bated breath. To the south, Spain was forming from the union of Castile and Aragon, a new power eager to expand. To the east, the Holy Roman Empire looked inward, jealous of the wealth that still flowed from Anglo-French ports. And on the seas, Portugal began to push beyond the familiar coasts, seeking riches in Africa and across the Atlantic. In this alternate world, the Anglo-French kingdom stood poised to dominate exploration as well. But its internal fractures threatened to squander that advantage. Still, even weakened, it remained vast and formidable. Its armies, though divided by roses, still dwarfed those of its neighbors. Its trade networks bound Flanders, Bordeaux, and London into one of the wealthiest markets in Europe. Its cultural weight was immense, producing poets and chroniclers who now spoke of a dual heritage, of a people who were no longer merely English or French, but something greater, something new. The old order of kings ruling with unchallenged authority was dying. In its place arose something different, a kingdom vast yet decentralized, fragile yet enduring, where councils, parliaments, and estates shared power with a monarchy battered by war. It was not the empire Henry had envisioned, but it was something Europe had never seen before. A dual monarchy transformed into a federation of crowns, noble houses, and cities. The 100 Years' War had ended in English triumph, yet the century that followed did not belong wholly to England or to France. It belonged to this new, uneasy creation, an Anglo-French world born in conquest, tempered in civil war, and destined to reshape the path of Europe in ways neither king nor peasant could have foreseen. And as the 15th century gave way to the 16th, a question loomed like a thunderhead over the horizon. Would this fragile order hold long enough to grasp the riches of the New World, or would it tear itself apart before destiny could call? The dawn of the 16th century rose over a Europe forever changed. Where once two bitter rivals had waged ceaseless war, now a hybrid kingdom straddled the channel. Its very existence bent the course of history, twisting familiar paths into strange new shapes. The Anglo-French order that emerged from conquest and civil war became not merely a political experiment, but the foundation for a new age. Culturally, the fusion was inescapable. In courts from Westminster to the Louvre, nobles spoke a curious mixture of tongues. English lords quoted French poets, French knights read English chronicles, plays performed in London echoed themes of chivalry once confined to Paris, while troubadours in Bordeaux sang of kings who ruled across seas as though it were natural. Architects blended the soaring lines of French Gothic with the solid stone traditions of English fortresses, giving rise to cathedrals that were neither one nor the other, but both. The very notion of nationhood began to blur. In society, this mingling reshaped identity itself. Children of mixed heritage no longer asked if they were French or English. They were Anglo-French, heirs to a world where the Channel was not a border but a bridge. Merchants married across coasts, peasants migrated in search of safer fields, and even soldiers serving under rival roses shared a sense of belonging to a realm larger than any single province. This new identity did not erase divisions, but it created bonds strong enough to endure them. Economically, the dual crown stood astride Europe's arteries of trade. The wool of England, the wines of Bordeaux, the salt of Brittany, and the grain of Normandy all flowed into a single market. Flemish weavers grew rich, their looms supplied without interruption. Ports such as Rouen and Calais thrummed with commerce, rivaling Venice in scale. With resources consolidated, the Anglo-French kingdom was well positioned to challenge Iberian rivals in the coming age of exploration. Ships bearing the twin banners set out into the Atlantic, probing coasts of Africa and, eventually, the strange new lands across the Western Ocean. Politically, however, the legacy was more fragile. The crown had been weakened by generations of civil war. Parliaments in London and estates in Paris both demanded power, forcing monarchs to rule by negotiation as often as by decree. Nobles, emboldened by their victories during the Wars of the Roses, maintained semi-independent dominions. Burgundy, Brittany, and Gascony acted less like provinces than partners in a loose federation. It was an empire of compromise, not command, And though it endured, it lacked the cohesion of the centralized states beginning to rise elsewhere. This had consequences. Spain, unified under Ferdinand and Isabella, emerged as a tightly bound power, hurling its strength into the conquest of the New World. The Holy Roman Empire remained fractured, but its princes eyed Anglo-French weakness with opportunity. The Ottoman Empire advanced in the east, testing Europe's borders. And though the dual crown was vast, its energies were often consumed by managing its own nobles rather than confronting external threats. Yet fragility did not mean impotence. The Anglo-French realm was too rich, too populous, and too strategically placed to collapse easily. Its ships sailed the Atlantic. Its merchants filled Europe's markets. Its armies, though divided, could still summon more men than most neighbors. Its cultural weight, spread through universities in Paris and Oxford alike, gave it influence in theology, law, and science. It was not a centralized empire, but it was undeniably a great power, one that no rival could ignore. And beneath the surface, deeper consequences unfolded. The very idea of the nation-state, which in our timeline crystallized in opposition, England against France, took on a different shape. Here, identity was plural, layered, hybrid. To be Anglo-French was to hold two traditions in one, to see oneself as both islander and continental, both conqueror and conquered. Such a conception blurred the boundaries of sovereignty, shaping Europe's political imagination for centuries to come. By the time the Renaissance blossomed, painters and poets celebrated not the triumph of one crown over another, but the strange, uneasy marriage of two. Scholars debated whether unity was destiny or delusion, whether the Channel was truly conquered, or whether it remained an invisible divide. The legacy of conquest was not a single empire shining in glory, but a federation of crowns, provinces, and identities learning, however uneasily, to coexist. The 100 Years' War had ended not in France's salvation, but in its absorption. Yet what rose in its place was not a simple English empire, but something more complex, more enduring, and more ambiguous. A realm forged in war, tempered by rebellion, and carried forward by necessity into an uncertain future. And as the 16th century marched on, one question remained unanswered. Could this uneasy union survive the storms of Reformation, exploration, and empire yet to come? Or was it destined to fracture, leaving behind only echoes of what might have been? The 100 Years' War, in our own history, ended with the French triumphant, their kingdom reforged in fire and faith, their English foes driven back across the Channel. But in this alternate tale, we have walked the other road, the path where the lilies bent to the lions, and England's dream of ruling France came true. It was not a victory without cost. The Anglo-French realm emerged vast, yet fractured, glorious, yet unstable. Its kings wore two crowns, but ruled by compromise. Their banners stretched across lands too different, too proud, too burdened by memory to ever fully unite. Civil wars and rebellions scarred its early decades, yet from the chaos there rose a new identity. A people who no longer called themselves only English or French, but Anglo-French, heirs to two traditions bound together by both conquest and necessity. The legacy of this dual monarchy reshaped Europe. The Auld Alliance collapsed, leaving Scotland isolated. Iberia, facing a neighbor of immense size, pushed harder for unity and expansion across the seas. The Holy Roman Empire, uneasy and divided, grappled with a power that straddled both island and continent. And across the Mediterranean, Italian bankers and merchants recalibrated their ledgers to account for a new commercial giant. In culture and society, this hybrid kingdom blended tongues, laws, and customs, creating a renaissance of its own, one where Oxford and Paris shared scholars, where cathedrals rose that fused Gothic splendor with English strength, where poets sang of an identity broader than any one crown. Economically, the empire dominated continental trade and launched voyages across oceans, carrying its lions and lilies banners into the unknown. Politically, it stumbled between centralization and fragmentation, a federation of crowns, parliaments, and provinces that endured despite its weaknesses. And so, we are left with the haunting image of a Europe profoundly altered. A channel that in our world divided enemies instead became a bridge uniting realms. A war that in reality forged two nations instead produced one, awkward yet immense. A dream that history denied, in English France, becomes here the foundation of a new order. But with that image comes the question, would you want to live in such a world? A world where national identities blurred centuries earlier, where Scotland may have been absorbed, where Spain's dominance might have been checked, where the great voyages of discovery may have carried not Spanish or Portuguese flags, but banners bearing both lions and lilies? Would this world have been more stable, more prosperous, or more chaotic, its endless compromises tearing it apart before destiny could unfold? History reminds us that nothing is inevitable. The Hundred Years' War could so easily have tipped the other way. One arrow at Orleans, one illness avoided, one alliance held firm, and our world might have been unrecognizable. So, what do you think? Would the Anglo-French Empire have endured to become the first true European superpower? Or would it have collapsed under the weight of its contradictions, remembered only as a fleeting dream carved in blood and fire? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this journey into an alternate past, don't forget to like the video, share it with friends who love history, and subscribe for more explorations of the worlds that might have been. Because history is not only about what was, it is also about what could have been.